necessary in their existence, in which case they exist necessarily. Now, imagine you were walking on the beach and you found a large translucent globe lying there. You would surely say, where did this come from? Why does this exist? Well, suppose the globe were a little bit bigger. Suppose it were the size of a house. You'd still wonder why it was there, where it came from. Suppose it were as big as the United States. The size wouldn't make any difference. You'd still say, why does it exist? Suppose it was the size of a galaxy. The question would still remain. Suppose it were the size of the universe. You would still say, why does such a thing exist? So it seems to me that first premise is certainly plausible, more plausible than it's contradictory. And from that it follows, therefore, that God must exist as a necessary being and the reason for the existence of the universe. I then turn to reasons to believe that Jesus is the decisive revelation of God. And here Eddie repudiated this whole approach by saying that the initial improbability of the resurrection is so great it cannot be overcome. Extraordinary events require extraordinary evidence. Let me say two things about this. First of all, this commonsensical slogan is demonstrably false. Probability theorists from Condorcet to John Stuart Mill discuss thoroughly what sort of evidence you have to have in order to establish the occurrence of a highly improbable event. And what they realized is that you cannot simply hold that extraordinary events require extraordinary evidence, because then you would never believe the report on last night's news of the winning pick in the lottery, because that's an extraordinarily improbable event, which would be absurd. Rather, what probability theorists found is that you must also consider the probability that if the event did not occur, then the evidence would be just as it is. In the case of the resurrection, this is the probability that if there were no resurrection, that we would have an empty tomb, resurrection appearances, the origin of the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection. And that, I think, is so improbable that it can counterbalance any intrinsic improbability that you might think lies in the resurrection itself. The second point, though, I want to make about this is that the resurrection is not improbable intrinsically. What is improbable is the hypothesis that Jesus rose naturally from the dead. That is incredibly improbable, but the Christian agrees that that is not likely to have happened. The hypothesis is God raised Jesus from the dead. And given the existence of God established by the cosmological, the contingency, and the argument from evil that Eddie didn't refute, we have good reasons to believe that God exists. So this is not an intrinsically improbable event. I showed that most scholars today believe in the historicity of the empty tomb. He's right, it isn't mentioned in Paul explicitly, but it is implied in Paul in 1 Corinthians 15. And moreover, it's mentioned in the pre-Markan Passion story, which goes back to within the first few years after Jesus' death. So the fact is, most New Testament critics accept the historicity of the empty tomb. With respect to the post-mortem appearances, again, he's correct that the Greek word ophthei does not indicate whether these are physical or non-physical appearances. It just means that Jesus appeared. Paul's experience on the Damascus Road was unusual because it was a post-ascension encounter. And thus Paul says, he appeared to me as one born out of time because Christ had already ascended. And he didn't speak to the problem of the origin of the disciples' belief in the resurrection. It was utterly improbable that they would have come up with this given their Jewish thought frame. Notice he provides no alternative explanation, and that's in line with contemporary scholarship. Contemporary scholarship recognizes no alternative explanation to these facts other than the resurrection of Jesus. Now, what about Eddie's objections to Christianity, such as the doctrine of hell? I want to reemphasize, biblical inerrancy is not the issue tonight because many Christians don't accept biblical inerrancy. What we're dealing with are those essential facts not established by evidence. He says, but look, God could have made me more inclined to accept the truth. I would argue, number one, that God overcomes this by his prevenient grace, my proclivity to turn away from him. And then secondly, there's no guarantee that in a world such as Eddie envisions, that the balance between saved and lost would be any better than it is in this world. He says, but Craig wishes universal salvation were true. And I say God wishes it as well. It is only because of the free will of human beings that universal salvation is not true. And thus I think this provides no substantive objection to the Christian faith.
Okay, well, Dr. Craig says, so biblical inerrancy is not an issue. Fine. Biblical inerrancy is not an issue. Let's take the Bible as possibly wrong, and that the doctrine of hell is wrong, and that no good, decent, loving God would send you to hell forever for not believing in Jesus. Notice that Dr. Craig never responded to my points about the supernatural generally. Let me read what Thomas Jefferson, third President of the United States, once wrote to John Adams, the second President of the United States. And the day will come when the mystical generation of Jesus, by the Supreme Being as his Father in the womb of a virgin, will be classed with the fable of the generation of Minerva in the brain of Jupiter. You see, our third President of the United States was worried about supernatural claims that are unprovable. Now, Dr. Craig says that there is no reason to reject these supernatural claims if you have God as the factor in making them come about. Okay, well then my claim that I arrived here tonight on a Martian-built flying saucer is implausible until I tell you that God gave me that flying saucer directly. Does that add anything? Of course not. Well, that's no different than Dr. Craig's position. Now, with respect to this concept of the heavy bowling ball resting on a cushion being simultaneous causation so that the cause could have happened and cause and effect. Remember, when that bowling ball presses in on that cushion, its pressing in precedes the indentation. The indentation goes along with the bowling ball. The cushion doesn't see the bowling ball come and say, okay, this is heavy, I'm going to indent before it gets here. So when we speak logically about cause and effect, we are always talking, if we're speaking logically, about a cause that precedes its effect in time. And since there was no time and space before the Big Bang, we are simply saying what's north of the North Pole. Now, Dr. Craig assumes that it would be preposterous for something to pop into existence out of nothing. Well, where does Dr. Craig's invisible God pop into existing out of nothing? But you see, what he does is he says, okay, because this is God, that he is exempt from causation. He is exempt from the laws of cause and effect. But then he's just making up an excuse so he can avoid the laws of cause and effect, which he says otherwise obtain, so he can have an excuse for his God to remain uncaused. But that doesn't solve the problem. Now, with respect to the question of the resurrection being so unusual regarding Jewish thought, that it was such a paradigm shift that something supernatural had to happen, that is not evidence of the supernatural. If I were able to convince Dr. Craig or some other Christian that reincarnation is true, that would not make it true. If tomorrow morning you saw Dr. Craig at the LA airport singing Hare Krishna, handing out books of the Bhagavad Gita, that doesn't mean that the Hare Krishna would become true, even though that's a major paradigm shift. So you can have major paradigm shifts explainable without recourse to the supernatural. Now, as far as objective moral values is concerned, Dr. Craig always says that we cannot have an objective basis for condemning rape without the biblical God. I think it's time for Bill Craig to have a talk with his God, because that God condones rape. In Deuteronomy 20:14, it is ordered that God's people take the women, children, and cattle of conquered territory as the spoils of war, which spoils are a gift for God. In Numbers 31:18, Moses, with God's approval, orders his men to take for themselves very young girls if they are virgins, and they are called women children. So we've got a God who's a child molester. God is more than happy to reward Moses for this by urging him to distribute the spoils. Also, rape is never considered wrong with respect to the woman. In Deuteronomy 22:28, 29, if a woman is raped by an unbetrothed virgin is raped, she's forced to marry the man who raped her. I mean, this is absolutely preposterous. Also, Jesus had a problem with his prophecies. In Matthew 24:34 and Mark 13:30, he says that the generation of listeners now hearing his words will still be alive at his second coming. C.S. Lewis, the great Christian theologian, wrote that these passages are most embarrassing in the Bible and show ignorance on the part of Jesus. We're still waiting for Jesus to come back. And also, we have a problem with the generation of Jesus. In the book of Matthew, it says that Joseph, husband of Mary, had one father named Heli. In another gospel, it says his name was Jacob. Joseph couldn't have had two fathers. So you see, what we have here